Hello, and welcome to Amplifying Women's Voices, the state of research on women's empowerment. I'm Eddie Molesky, the director of Duke Center for International Development. We're pleased to host this event and bring together some of our key partners in international development, including the World Bank, Oxfam, Harvard University, and the University of California at Berkeley. We also appreciate each of you for taking time to join us and hear more about the latest research on critical women's issues. DCID's mission is to engage in problem-oriented research and through research and translation and education, get cutting-edge innovations directly in the hands of policymakers. We have a range of programs, including a master's in international development, ongoing research projects and grants, and executive training programs in monitoring and evaluation, behavior economics, and public finance. At DCID, we frequently conduct research, hold trainings, manage projects, and host events such as the one today to spark conversations and inform policies that promote peace and prosperity for all. Today's event is especially important for us. It's hard to ignore the fact that all of our lives have been and continue to be greatly impacted by the pandemic and the political turmoil around us. The pandemic has ignored geographic, class, and ethnic boundaries and disrupted all our lives. I've been thinking about women's issues a lot during the pandemic because a critical factor that still remains relatively unexplored is the health and well-being of women and how the pandemic has affected all of them. One critical pattern in many countries around the world is that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women who had to take on greater responsibilities as lockdowns kept families and kids home from school, and many who worked in jobs that were service-oriented or educational jobs that required greater risk. However, as will become evident in the four presentations today, many women around the world lack the political power and opportunities for electoral and non-electoral participation to advocate for themselves. As International Women's Day approaches on March 8th, we hope that this event will provide a more nuanced view of women's rights and opportunities in both political and economic spaces that will open the door for more dialogue on women's issues. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kate Viborny, a development economist trained at Oxford, who's engaged in fascinating research of her own on women's economic participation and political participation. She's an associate director of Duke University's Dev Lab and an instructor here at DCID in our Masters for International Development program. Kate will be our discussant and our docent in today's tour through these really important research initiatives on women's issues. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Eddie, and welcome again, everyone. We're really excited to have a fantastic panel of speakers today who are going to talk about some really interesting and extremely policy relevant research on the cutting edge of thinking about key issues in women's empowerment. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers first up front so you have a sense of who's on the panel, and then I'll ask them to go ahead and take it away and share their research with us. So our first presenter is Dr. Jan Cooper, who's a research associate in the Harvard School of Public Health. Over the past decade, she's been studying incentive and cash transfer programs in India and Tanzania. She's focused a lot on demand and supply side incentives for health promotion and women's access to healthcare. Previously, she served as a postdoctoral fellow with the Poverty Action Lab, JPAL. In that role, she was also working on issues related to cash transfers, maternal and child health, and thinking hard about how to measure women's agency. She holds a PhD in health policy from the University of California at Berkeley, and she's going to be speaking about her work on how constraints to women's agency change whether or not incentive programs for health are effective. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Susan Hyde, who's the co-author of the Medaketa Project and professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. She studies international influences on domestic politics, teaches in the fields of international relations and comparative politics, and is active in promoting policy relevant research. She has expertise on election observation, election fraud, and democracy promotion, And today she's going to talk about a meta-cata, so a multi-country coordinated, huge sort of set of studies that's designed to really give a global idea of the effectiveness of interventions of women action committees to help enhance women's participation in democracy outside of just the voting process. Dr. Dia Dutta is a social development research consultant at Oxfam, and also an independent researcher and activist. She holds a PhD in sociology from JNU. She was awarded the prestigious Commonwealth Scholarship to read for the MPhil degree in development studies from Oxford. And she's been involved in grassroots research in India and elsewhere in South Asia for more than 18 years. She's been working in depth on issues related to gender-based violence, unpaid care work, adolescent sexual and reproductive health rights, and women's political leadership in local level governance. She's worked with the UN, leading think tanks in India and Oxfam previously. And finally, Dr. Jacob de Hoop, who's a senior economist at the World Bank's Poverty and Equity Global Practice and the co-leader of the Gender Innovation Lab for Latin America and the Caribbean at the bank. He's a senior economist. Before joining the World Bank, he worked as a humanitarian policy research manager at UNICEF Innocenti, was a member of the Transfer Project, and worked as a researcher at the ILO. He holds a PhD from Tinbergen University and the Free University of Amsterdam, and he's going to speak about uneven recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean, whether women are being left behind in the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think there's a lot of really fascinating insights we're going to learn from each individual panelist and also from the conversation between them at the end. So we're looking forward to that. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jan Cooper to start the first presentation. Thank you.
Great. Just want to confirm that you can see my screen okay? Yeah, we're good. Great. Well, thank you, Kate, for that introduction. So as Kate mentioned, I'll be talking about cash transfers for health and some considerations and some implications for women's decision-making power and women's agency. And then how we can extend these lessons to how we think about how we measure women's agency.
Sorry, Jen, we can see the Zoom box, if you would mind.
Oh, yes.
Minimizing the Zoom box. Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Are we all set? Is this good?
Yes.
Great. So there's growing evidence that incentives can be used to improve health outcomes, and cash transfers are one form of an incentive. It's cash given directly to beneficiaries. Cash transfer programs can take multiple forms. They can be implemented in the form of an unconditional cash transfer given to any beneficiary who is eligible for the program, or they can take the form of conditional cash transfers given to beneficiaries when they meet specific pre-identified conditions of the program. And while these programs hold a lot of promise, they've also yielded mixed results, which raises questions about how they work and how we can structure them and design them to make them work best. And so, for instance, in a systematic review that we conducted, our findings highlight that some subgroups of target populations benefit more than others from the programs, and that the benefits are not uniformly distributed across the population. And these findings suggest in part that some subgroups are better able to productively use cash transfers for health or for other beneficial outcomes. And some subgroups might be better able to meet the conditions of a cash transfer program. And really, the underlying assumption in cash transfer programs and incentive programs for health is an assumption of choice or the beneficiary's ability to change their choices and behavior and have agency and control over outcomes that they're acting on. So to illustrate this, I'm turning to two experiments that we conducted in Tanzania, which use cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, to try and reduce HIV incidence and STIs. And there's a lot of potential for cash transfers to work for HIV and STIs because they can address some of the underlying poverty drivers that can put people at risk for HIV. And they can also help shift the decision-making from thinking about avoiding a potential health risk in the future or in the distant future to having a salient benefit, the cash transfer, in the immediate and the short term. So our starting point is the RESPECT study in Tanzania. This is work led by Will Dow from UC Berkeley and Damien DeWalk at the World Bank, which was a randomized study which enrolled couples of men and women and enrolled them to either a control group where they were tested routinely over the course of a year for STIs and HIV, or they were eligible to receive a low or a high value cash transfer award that they would receive only when they test negative for an STI. And the main finding of the RESPECT study was that those who were enrolled to or eligible to receive the high value cash transfer amount did have a significantly lower incidence of STIs after 1 year. The thing is that we know also that women's relationship power can affect their risk for STIs and HIV. And so the question here that we looked at was, does women's relationship power moderate the effectiveness of the cash transfer in this intervention on STIs? And to answer this, we looked at a sample of about 1,000 women. We measured their relationship power, and then we looked at their STI incidence after 1 year. And we found that among the two groups of women, those who had a low amount of relationship power, which is on the left-hand side, compared to those who had a high amount of relationship power on the right-hand side. We can see that among women with low relationship power, the conditional cash transfer didn't have any difference, whether they were in a high or low value cash transfer arm, didn't have an influence on their STI outcomes. However, we can see that among women with high relationship power, those who are eligible for the high value cash transfer were able to reduce their risk and their incidence of STIs after 1 year. But the question is, how are women using their agency or decision-making power? And what are the kinds of decisions and the kinds of control that are affected when women are eligible to receive conditional cash transfer? And so this led us to a second experiment that built on the findings from the RESPECT-2 pilot. And here this was a pilot study among female sex workers in Tanzania to assess the feasibility and acceptability of a cash transfer for HIV prevention among this population. And among female sex workers in Tanzania, their drivers of risky sexual behaviors and HIV acquisitions are the economic forces and client preferences, alcohol and drug use among clients and female sex workers, and the social norms in the region that they're working on. And so we did a qualitative sub-study among participants in the study at baseline and at endline to look and to try and understand the domains of decision-making that were affected by cash transfer programs and which ones seemed to be most relevant to yield changes in their behaviors. And so in particular, we looked at their socioeconomic power, their sort of logistical power around how they influence or how they organize their sex work or their business decisions, and then also their interpersonal power, which is the negotiations that they have with their clients. And the main finding that we came to from the qualitative sub-study was that a conditional cash transfer in this population of high-risk women in Tanzania had the greatest impact over their domains of work logistic or their logistical power. And so And so interventions that are trying to change people's behaviors and change their choices and their actions need to be paying particularly close attention to the domains and types of decisions that women are able to control and are able to affect outcomes. Yet the issue is that women's agency is hard to measure. It is multi-dimensional, and there are several different domains of agency. And so someone can have control over one domain of decisions and very little control over other types of decisions. And women's agency is manifested in different ways in different settings. And also, agency isn't something that is directly observable. It's considered a postulated attribute, and that it affects outcomes. A woman's agency herself isn't visible, but it affects outcomes that we can measure. And so to address this, we have worked to develop a new measure, a new approach to measure agency, which includes both qualitative data and quantitative close-ended questions. And what we're introducing is a new method to select the best set or subset of close-ended quantitative questions that best track our qualitative data. And we think that this has the potential to help us design survey modules that can be applied to large-scale data collection in impact evaluations or other large-scale settings. So to do this, we started off with a sample of about 200 women in northern India. And we conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews, which we consider as a true assessment of their agency. And this is because these in-depth interviews are rich, deep discussions that probe into respondents' answers, rationales, motivations, and constraints on their choices. And then we also asked these women a series of 63 close-ended multiple choice questions. And these are a lot of the standard questions that we use in a lot of surveys or some of the DHS questions and so on. And then we coded the qualitative interviews across 6 different domains. And after coding them, we assigned each particular woman a score for each of these different domains, where a higher score, which is corresponding to a 4, would equal that woman has a lot of control and agency in that domain, and women who score a 1 have very little control in that domain. And similarly, we also analyzed the close-ended quantitative questions and applied machine learning algorithms to figure out which is the 5 best survey questions out of the 63 that best predict and that are most closely related to our true measure of agency that we captured in the qualitative surveys. So here are the top 5 surveys for this context in northern India that we came up with, which relate predominantly to decisions over purchases and spending, along with excursions outside of the home to see friends or to visit a healthcare provider. But data from different contexts and different settings will certainly yield different sets of questions. And so we think that this approach, the main contribution is that we're helping develop a new approach to capture agency that can be transferred to different settings. And it can be replicated in other settings and potentially for other constructs. So in summary, cash transfers hold promise, but the literature yields mixed results. Agency over decisions influences the effectiveness of cash transfer programs for health outcomes. And because agency is multidimensional and we've developed proposed a new way to measure agency that uses qualitative and quantitative data. So acknowledgement for our funders for various different pieces of this work. And over to you, thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll now turn it over to Dr. Susan Hyde, who's going to present about enhancing women's non-electoral participation through women's action committees, 5 coordinated experiments on engendering collective efficacy and political engagement.
Great, thank you. Let me just get my screen started here. Wonderful. Well, good morning from Berkeley to everyone. I know we're spanning a lot of time zones today. I'm going to be, I changed the title a little bit, and I'll pre-announce that there are no, sorry, I have to put this away. There are no results in this presentation. We are in the early stages of a project that was disrupted by COVID. And many of the teams are hoping to get to the field very soon. This on the right is just a photo of women in Argentina, the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, who were quite active in advocating against the dictatorship. There's lots of forms of political participation that I think we haven't spent enough time talking about, so that's partly what this project is motivated by. I'm part of a big team. I'll show the full team at the end, but there's 27 of us participating in this project, 27 academics and 5 teams. And this project was initiated in part because we wanted to better understand how in countries that have hybrid political institutions, which combine aspects of democracy and authoritarianism, and in which electoral accountability is not particularly functional. Most countries in the world have elections, but the degree to which politicians can be held accountable in those elections varies pretty widely. And there's a sense that even in countries with more authoritarian institutions, citizens can potentially mobilize in order to increase the provision of local public services. This is something that we've documented. It includes less non-electoral political participation by women. I'll show a slide about that in just a second. It's not true everywhere, but it's true in a lot of countries that men and women may vote at very similar rates, but the degree to which women are active in ways outside of voting in political life is quite varied, and often in many countries much less than the activism of men. And we consider that a bit of an issue, a problem, or at least something to think carefully about, in part because it can mean that their voices are less represented in decision-making at the local level and can affect a whole range of services that may be of particular interest to women. We started this project thinking about a desire for more collective action mobilization by women, so women mobilizing as women, as a group, and have come up with a proposal for interventions designed to mobilize women in a deeper way, not just providing them information. So I'll just show this here. This is probably, if you're on a small screen, something you can't see. I'll just say that this is a couple of questions from the various global barometers of a lot of things that show a fairly consistent, again, true in many places, but not all places, gap in non-electoral forms of political participation between men and women. The question that we have that really underlies this is that in political science especially, and I think political science is in many ways behind the curve in some of these questions, but in many ways, people have been relying on interventions that are basically just providing more information to groups in an effort to mobilize them. The theory being something like if they're better informed, they're more likely to participate. And it's become increasingly clear from a handful of studies that to increase any marginalized group's participation, you may need to provide information and resources. Those may be necessary conditions, but they're probably insufficient to overcome what are often structural barriers. So even in these settings with structural inequality between men and women, or between a dominant group and less represented political groups, can women's non-electoral political participation be increased by reducing other barriers, which we're focusing in this project on psychological barriers to collective action. Specifically, we're drawing on this theory, SIMCA theory, the social identity model of collective action. And the motivating question is whether women's collective action can be facilitated by increasing 3 things that we think are jointly necessary above and beyond information and resources to mobilize women to take collective action at the local level within their communities. These are increasing group-based identification, increasing a sense of group-based injustice, and increasing collective efficacy beliefs. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how this might apply in a lot of places. The general argument is that intervening with women's action committees and providing these 3 things, increasing the sense of group identification as women or as women from those communities, increasing a sense of group-based injustice, and increasing collective efficacy will together, not independently, but together, increase the chances that women will be willing to take collective action and demand more local services that benefit them as a group. We provide information about how to participate to everyone. This is a fairly standard way to intervene and to engage in programmatic activity in many places that are targeting political participation by women. And the goal here is to test whether this SIMCA framework, this social identity model of collective action, and this more intensive group-based effort can actually be effective. Okay, we have a whole host of outcomes that we're going to be looking at. Many of them are coming from individual surveys. There are individual survey-based questions related to a recognition of shared injustices as women. There's also individual survey-based questions about the salience of gender identity within the community that we're hoping to see changes on. And then there's also a behavioral outcome that is the opportunity to apply for a community grant. So we want to move beyond just whether women are changing how they respond on a survey, but whether they are able to take advantage of an opportunity that will be provided to all of the participating communities to apply for a small community grant. And through that process, we'll be looking at not just whether they apply, but the how they apply, the quality of their participation in that process, in addition to the level. So I've been dancing around the method here, but so I just talked about the substance. The way that we're going about this is a project that I've been involved with for quite a while now. The EGAP is a research network that focuses, stands for Evidence in Governance and Politics. It's largely people who are interested in policy relevant research, and there's a lot of organizations and practitioner organizations that are part of the network. We created this effort to fund coordinated field experiments. There's a lot of sense that you can learn a limited amount from a single field experiment in terms of its external validity. This has long been a criticism of individual field experimental studies, especially in political science, where the generalizability of these things is really important to understand. And so the Mediketa initiative funds research, but requires the participating independent research teams to coordinate on the intervention, the outcomes, and a number of other things, including our own standards for ethics and thinking carefully about some of these things. And then we pre-register the meta-analysis of the cluster of studies that are coming out of this. We have had a number of challenges already. Most of the studies were supposed to go into the field, I think, in 2020. I think everyone probably knows why that didn't happen. And but we also had one study site changed. With the team had proposed and planned to do the study in Myanmar. And of course, there's been a military coup, and it became less plausible that they could do this type of project in the field. This is the team, very briefly. Eddie Molesky, who introduced the panel, and myself are the co-chairs of the steering committee. We have some other excellent scholars who have been helping us with the coordination. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see those who are actually going to be in the field doing all of this work. And it's been a real pleasure to work with everyone on these issues. I am going to stop my screen share and just say that I was a little weary of presenting not a project where we don't have any results yet, but it is a really useful thing for us to get feedback on this project at this time. So I look forward to hearing from others and from those who are here with any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Dia Datta, who's going to present on risk factors for gender-based violence, the case of Indian agriculture.
Thanks, Kate, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined from all over the world. Thank you for making time for this. I'm going to present a brief study, a background study that I did with a co-researcher, Isadora Frankenthal, who is a master's student at MIT. And this is a background research towards larger research at some other point. We've just concluded it. I'm sorry about the month mentioned here. It's January. That's when we published it from Oxfam America and made the presentation. I haven't changed the month, but it's very recent. We worked on it for the greater part of last year. Needless to say, we're looking at the Assam tea sector actually, and we're looking at female tea workers at the Assam tea plantations. And there's very little literature available on female tea workers in Assam. So I think that's been one of the biggest findings of the study, that that there's very little evidence available at the moment through which we can actually look at the kind of structural discrimination and exploitation that happens to tea workers and labor rights violations. Okay, so I will start, allow me one moment. I will start with a background to the Assam tea sector. In the study, we're analyzing the effects of workplace, that is the tea plantations in Assam, on workplace and domestic violence. So we're only focusing on sexual violence at workplace, and we're looking at domestic violence of the same female tea workers who live on these tea estates and for whom the personal and the professional spaces are very blurred. A majority of women employed in agriculture in India are linked to tea plantations. And an interesting fact is that while 97 to 98% of the Indian economy is in the informal sector, tea workers are the only, and I mean, agriculture is largely informal economy. Tea workers are so far mostly part of the formal economy, although there's been a very, very recent introduction of a new labor code, a set of labor codes in which tea plantation workers are going to be considered as unskilled and informal workers, which will change a host of entitlements, rights, etc. for them to come. But that it's still too premature to actually talk about it. So we assume here that most of tea plantation workers are formal workers with rights and laws backing their rights. Living on tea plantations give their managers overwhelming power over the lives of female tea workers. And as I said, the lines between personal and professional violence are blurred. They're never away from home or from work, and therefore cannot avoid either completely. There is evidence that employers do not ensure that workers have adequate living conditions, which is a sign of favoring profit maximization at different stages of the value chain at the expense of worker well-being. While Assam produces more than half of all the tea in India, it ranks fourth highest as per the National Crime Records Bureau of 2018 data on violence against women. Women experience physical, sexual, and verbal abuse on and off the plantations in Assam, as well as sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence in workplace settings. 39% of female tea plantation laborers confirmed the presence of violence in their private sphere. The colonizers, the historical background to this violence is that the colonizers took an especially dehumanizing attitude towards tea estate workers during the colonial times. According to scholars, the structure of power hierarchy based on labor coercion and extra legal authority developed during the 1860s with the introduction of indenture system by the British. This period shaped the attitudes of European planters towards their labor. A huge demographic gap emerged between the planters and the migrant labor. By the end of the 19th century, there were approximately 1,000 planters among a population of over 500,000 laborers. The indenture regime was thus devised to preserve the planters' authority, keeping the workforce disciplined and intimidated. It was enforced by legislation from the colonial state, which provided the legitimacy. To give one particular grim example, in 1888, a Bengal government official found a planter organizing a polyandrous marital union between 5-time expired male laborers and a single woman. In return, each man had agreed to re-engage in the same garden for an additional 5 years. According to that official, the disposal of marriage of all imported female coolies or unskilled migrant laborers is regarded as a matter of entirely within the jurisdiction of the manager. The conditions of the tea plantation workers of Assam did not improve even after independence was attained. In fact, the same power relationships were transferred from the colonial to the post-independent India. The majority changes post-independence were the enactment of the Plantations Labor Act of 1951, which made provisions for housing, medical facilities, minimum wages, and water and sanitation, among other provisions. The benefits provided by the PLA were turned into instruments that retain employers' power over the workers through enforced dependence. It is also the cause, along with the low green leaf tea prices, of excessive financial pressure on tea companies, making it challenging for them to keep their legal obligations to provide benefits to the required standards. Besides, labor laws passed over time were extended to the plantation estates. A third development was the introduction of trade unions affiliated with different political parties. Since they were affiliated with political parties, their allegiance remained with the parties rather than with supporting the cause of workers. While the ownership and management of the tea estates moved from the British to the Indian owners, there was a tendency among the trade unions, who were mainly from the tea estate planter class and not the worker class, to compromise with the PLA enacted by the government of India. The PLA legitimized exploitation of the plantation workers from the colonial era. I'm not going to go into details about this. The literacy levels of tea tribal women are extremely low, and that also contributes to their low status in society and economy. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so I just want to acknowledge, I mean, I'm representing this study, but I would like to acknowledge the excellent contribution by my co-researcher, Isadora Frankenthal, that I spoke about earlier. I would also like to thank Rosario Castro from Oxfam America, who's kind of guided us through this research as our kind of commissioning manager. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a little bit about the data that we've used. This is a mixed methods study where we looked at quantitative data from what in the USA is the DHS data, but the root data set that DHS uses is actually the National Family Health Survey that the Statistical Office of Government of India actually develops. This is the 2015-16 domestic violence module of the NFHS survey. It's a comprehensive household health survey conducted every few years, includes data on domestic violence, education, occupation, ethnicity, among other socio-demographic variables. Around 79,000 ever married women about violence were asked about whether violence was perpetrated by a partner. Weights available for nationally representative sample, very specific yes or no questions, and interviewers were extensively trained, and interviews in private and interruptions recorded. GPS data of each household is also available. I'm, in the interest of time, not sharing the GPS data, the images here, because that part of the research was actually done by Isadora, and I don't think it would be fair for me to share. Next slide, please. So what are the characteristics that are correlated with domestic violence for female agricultural workers in India? Some of our research questions for domestic violence were: what is the relationship between socio-demographic characteristics and domestic violence? What is the relationship between women's decision-making power within the household and domestic violence? Does the place of work matter for the incidence of domestic violence? Do women in tea planting areas experience more or less domestic violence? And of course, the methodology used for this was a multivariate regression analysis. Next slide, please. So on workplace violence, our questions were, according to past research, what are the characteristics that make certain kinds of employment more risky for women? To what extent are these characteristics present in the tea sector in India? To what extent are these characteristics present in the data for agricultural workers? And this was mostly done through desk-based research. Next slide, please.
Dr. Dia, you have about 1 minute remaining.
Okay, sorry, I'm running a little late. I'll try and wrap up as soon as possible. Okay. So the quantitative data shows that there's strong positive correlation between domestic violence and family history of domestic violence, and whether partners drink, whether the partner drinks or not. Employment to a lesser extent, and respondent believes beating is justified also to a lesser extent. But there are strong negative correlations, next slide please, between domestic violence and respondents' education in years and household wealth. And the next slide please. Here it shows that respondents who work in their family are 5% less likely to report being victims of domestic violence. That does not actually mean that there is lower incidence of domestic violence. It's just that the reporting is less. Next slide, please. This kind of summarizes the findings of the study, temporary workers fare worse than permanent ones and are paid lower wages and do not have access to limited facilities and welfare that permanent workers have access to. Research finds that gender-based violence in Sri Lanka, molestation, unwanted touching, sexual advances, attempted rape, being watched while they bathe, and lack of privacy, threats of forthcoming sexual violence, sexist jokes, comments about their body and their personal sex life, and derogatory comments about menstruation were found in studies on Sri Lankan tea plantations. The similar kind of, there's evidence that there's similar kind of events happening in plantations in India as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my final slide. So the focus on female agricultural workers in India tea plantations to document what extent they are survivors of GBV and the factors that enable this. Document that both domestic and workplace violence are prevalent in this context. Most notably, alcohol abuse and whether the family has a history of domestic violence are the factors that are most strongly associated with domestic violence. There is reason to believe that both these factors are common on plantations. Laws do not suffice to mitigate the problem. This research is a first step towards connecting the contexts in which women are survivors of different kinds of GBV. Thank you. And I'm going to leave you with a slide which shows some of the key literature that we looked at.
Great. Thank you so much. So we'll now turn it over to our final speaker, Dr. Jacob de Hoop, who's going to present on an uneven recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean, are women being left behind?
I hope that you can see my slides okay. Thank you to the Duke team for organizing this and for inviting me to be a part of this great panel. It's a privilege to be here today. And thank you to everybody who's participating in this session today. What I'm going to do is present the findings of a joint effort implemented by the World Bank and the UNDP to track the impact of the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is an effort that was started quickly after the pandemic broke out in Latin America and the Caribbean, when many statistical offices had to stop their operations. At the time, the World Bank quickly set up an effort to collect phone survey data in many different countries in the region. And this data showed that women were 44% more likely than men to lose their employment after the start of the pandemic. This is a number that was widely cited. But now the question is this leading to a lasting or perhaps even a permanent deterioration in women's economic participation? And that's something I'll try to look at during this presentation. So nearly a year and a half later, a new round of phone survey data were collected in an even larger number of countries in the region, together by the World Bank and the UNDP, and this allows us to take stock of where we stand. I want to emphasize that this is the result of work by many different colleagues. It's literally dozens of people who have participated in this, and I just have the privilege to present some of the findings today. What I can say is I think the first immediate takeaway that I hope people will remember at the end of this presentation, which is that the results are concerning. Well over a year and a half after the start of the pandemic, the gendered impact on economic participation did not dissipate. It's still clearly visible. So, before jumping into the results, let me say a few words about the data that we're drawing on in this presentation. It's really an unprecedented effort by the World Bank and the UNDP to monitor the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. 3 survey waves were implemented in 2020. An additional 2 survey waves were implemented in June and December of 2021. The December 2021 survey wave is still under analysis, so what I can present today is the findings of the analysis based on the June 2021 data collection. That survey wave covered 24 countries, an average of about 1,200 individuals per country, so over 28,000 observations in the data set. And what's really interesting about this data collection effort is that the same questionnaire was administered in all of these 24 countries. So it allows for direct comparisons between countries and also for the generation of statistics at the regional level. The questionnaire contains a wide number of survey modules, and importantly for us today, it includes also a survey module on gender. Just to mention that the sample is nationally representative, but because this is a phone survey, it's nationally representative for those who are 18 and over and who have access to a phone. All right, so let's move to the first key finding of this work, which is that well into the pandemic, so in June of 2021, when many countries had started their economic recovery, declines in employment continued to be much more pronounced for women than for men. I can try to highlight this, I think you'll see it. So this is a decline in employment compared to the pre-pandemic level at the regional level. So for women, a 16 percentage point decline in employment, for men, a 7 percentage point decline in employment. And we see that both among the previously employed, the decline in employment is stronger for women than it is for men. And at the same time, among those who were previously unemployed, so who were not in employment before the pandemic, the entry into employment is larger among men than it is among women. So we see that this effect, this gendered effect of the pandemic on employment persists well into the economic recovery. Somehow I can't see the forward side. Here we go. So this has led to an increased gender gap in employment in all of the sub-regions in Latin America and the Caribbean, and almost all of the countries in the region. So this slide in bars shows you the gender gap in employment before the pandemic. And the triangles show you the gender gap in employment in June of 2021. And what we can see, as I said, is that in virtually all countries, the gender gap in employment has increased. Some of the most pronounced increases in the gender gap are visible in Central American countries, including Honduras, Nicaragua, but there are also pronounced gender gaps, for instance, in Bolivia, and also in some of the countries in the Caribbean, such as Antigua and Barbuda. Now, of course, there's more than just employment as such. We're also interested in understanding the quality of women's employment. And again, we see that it's not only the employment itself that declines, but also the quality of jobs that deteriorates. So if we look, for instance, at working hours, we see that women's working hours are 19% lower, conditional working, than they were before the pandemic. And for men, there's a substantial reduction too, but it's not as pronounced, 11% lower. And similarly, we see deteriorations for both men and women, actually, in terms of their participation in formal employment and their participation in wage employment. This is something to which we may return in a little bit if time allows. So what explains this increasing gender gap? What explains the high impact of the pandemic on women's employment? Well, a lot has been written about this. What I'm going to say will not be entirely new, but I still think it's quite insightful to see what is happening in the region. First of all, there's an increasing gender gap in caregiving. This was, of course, something we've all read about with schools closing. A lot of the burden in terms of childcare, accompanying children in their schoolwork, fell on the shoulders of women. And we can see that here in the left-hand graph. Women took on a larger share of the additional childcare burden, a larger share of the additional education burden than men did. And there's an association between increases in support to children's education and declines in employment. So the countries in which women experience a stronger increase in their caregiving responsibilities, in their support to children's education and schoolwork, are also the countries that experience stronger declines in employment. Of course, we need to be a little bit careful in interpreting this as causal, but at least this finding is in accordance with that story, that due to this increased caregiving burden, women were forced out of the labor market. All right, that's not the only explanation. Another explanation appears to be that the sectors, the economic sectors that predominantly employ women, continue to be depressed. So what we see here in the left-hand graph on the horizontal axis is the pre-pandemic share of female employment in different economic sectors. I don't know if you can read it well, but here in the top right corner, we have domestic services, which is almost entirely women. And for instance, here in the bottom, we have things like mining or utilities, which is almost employing only men. And on the vertical axis, we see the share of post-pandemic employment losses. And there's this clear positive correlation. The sectors that employ more women are also the sectors that were just much more heavily affected by the pandemic. And that continues to be the case well into the economic recovery. Interestingly, as we can see on the right-hand side, this is also leading to some changes in the sectors in which women are concentrated. So their concentration in household services or domestic services, in restaurants and tourism is declining. We see that they're more concentrated in sectors that were already employing more women, including education and health, but also some of the sectors that traditionally employ more men, such as agriculture. So we see this shift taking place in the concentration of their employment in different sectors, and it'll be interesting to see over time whether that will lead to a permanent change. So one final result, and then I'll move to some conclusions, which is to say that all these impacts on women's employment, on their economic lives, have repercussions well beyond in terms of other aspects of their well-being. And one example is what we see here in this slide. This shows you the correlation between women's mental health and changes in the employment rate. And it's when in this case, we're showing an index. The index is higher if women's mental health is worse. And we see that the countries that experience a stronger decline in employment are also the countries that exhibit worse rates of women's mental health. So this is suggestive evidence that the pandemic and its impact on employment and the time use of women is having repercussions into many other domains. Okay, so let me end by giving a few policy reflections. These are based on extensive work of the World Bank in terms of gender and women's economic empowerment, and some of the priority areas that we are trying to emphasize. One of them relates to digital technology. During the pandemic, of course, there was a big shift to digital technology, working from home, children schooling from home, purchasing online, etc. And it's absolutely vital that we make sure that any gaps, any gender gaps in terms of access to digital technology are closed, and that women in the future and now can be an equal part of all the opportunities that the digital technology are offering. Second, during the pandemic, there has been a strong expansion in terms of social safety nets, cash transfers that were presented during the first session. And there are opportunities to adapt these social safety nets, make them gender sensitive, ensure that they respond to the needs of women. The third one, this is very clear, I think, from the findings I presented, is that it's vital to address this shift in caregiving towards women and to make sure that provision, for instance, of quality childcare is available and can be used by many. It will have important implications not only for women who are able to enter employment as a result, but also economy-wide results that will be very important and can even have a sizable impact on GDP. Then making sure that women are included in finance, have access both at the personal and business level will be very important. And this relates to the earlier points of making sure that they have access to digital technology, digital sources of finance will be really important. And gender sensitive social protection systems can also help to bring this about. For instance, through the provision of cash transfers through digital payment methods. And finally, it's key to promote women's entrepreneurship, to level the playing field, and to make sure that women can operate in traditionally male-dominated sectors, which we know has important implications for the profitability of their businesses. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So thanks to all of our panelists. And at this time, everyone, please feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to share questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and ask a question to Jakob and Susan. So I'm going to have a few that are kind of bridging across our multiple panelists. Both of your projects, as you highlighted, really involve a huge coordination effort across multiple countries. And that's a really big and amazing achievement. It's clearly very challenging on the back end to make that happen. Could you share any examples of cases in which doing that kind of coordinated effort really made an impact on findings of the research? In the case of the Metacata, I know that you all are not presenting results today, but it's an ongoing initiative with multiple Metacatas on different topics. So maybe for the audience, you can give an idea of why is it important to do things that span like micro level studies, but in multiple contexts. So maybe I'll turn to Susan first, and then back to Jakob to give you a bit of a breather in between.
So in my work with EGAP, I've been involved with a lot of these multi-country coordinated studies, and it's fairly painful, I will say, but I think the payoff question is why we do it. And there's at least two ways where I think it's really useful. One is that it's often really difficult from a single study that has, for example, a null result or an unanticipated result to know if it's because you did something wrong in the study, or to know that for sure there's no effect associated with a particular intervention. And so in some ways it can be really a powerful way to show that a particular intervention that tons of money has been spent on around the world doesn't work anywhere, right? Like you can show it really convincingly as a null result, and then one can sort of learn really important lessons from that. I know a lot of people are afraid of null results, but I think from a policy perspective, it's really important to understand when there's a good idea that has failed on implementation grounds to have the effects that it's intended to have. And then secondly, in the way that I think is more positive, it's just really, I think it's inherent in a lot of the spaces in which I work that for actors who are involved in foreign aid and who are trying to do programming, international NGOs in multiple countries across different contexts, it's often the case that like specific program officers or something are able to say, oh, this worked in a different country I worked in, let's try it here. That's not very systematic in terms of thinking about when an intervention is more likely to be effective, or when it's more likely to cost a lot more money, or when so it allows us to start thinking about the conditions under which particular types of interventions are more or less likely to be effective. And the nice thing about independent research teams is that they do things slightly differently. So although we coordinate on a lot, there's also a little bit of variation, and sometimes that gives you the exact type of policy learning that you want to have, where you're like, oh, if we just do this, then this is more likely to work. And then that lesson can be taken forward to future projects. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. Jakob, do you want to say anything about this?
Sure. No, I think the cross-country approach was really that's really asking about the core and the purpose of this line of work, right? The objective was to understand what was going on in the entire Latin America and the Caribbean region. I will say that having comparable data based on identical questionnaires for different countries is very fascinating from a policy perspective. Of course, for us as an international or multilateral organization, it's interesting because it allows us to understand how the different countries compare, which countries require what type of approach. But also, I think at the country level, it's often quite interesting to see where your country ranks compared to others in the region. And it can be quite a forceful tool, because if you see that your country is like all the way at the end of the distribution and is really performing poorly compared to neighbors, that can be a good incentive, and it can show that progress is possible and actually is something that should be achieved because your neighbors are doing it. So there's no reason why you can't.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pick some questions that span again across multiple presenters from the Q&A. So if I'm going out of order, then please don't take it personally. I'm trying to do bridging here. So Krishna Priya has asked about to what extent this was directed to you, Jan. To what extent you think the questions finally selected for explaining empowerment might vary by location and context. And I thought there might be others on the panel who want to talk about this issue as well, but maybe it gives you a chance to talk about some of your your broader work on women's empowerment measurement too. So do you want to speak to that first, and then if anybody else on the panel wants to chime in, they could.
Yeah, so definitely we would anticipate that in different contexts would, if we replicate our work, that we'll identify a different set of 5 questions, depending on the domains and the dimensions of empowerment that are most salient in that context and to the population that we're looking at. So as a tangible example, in our population in Northern India, they often face constraints on their physical mobility and where and for what reasons and how far they can travel on their own. In other regions of the world, certainly that wouldn't be a constraint, and therefore might not be such a salient predictor of women's decision-making power. And so yeah, decisions around household spending, mobility, potentially ability to work. So we think that the questions will vary by setting, but we hope that this approach of using qualitative in-depth interviews and then using an algorithm to select the best close-ended questions is an approach that can be generalizable across settings. But yeah, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about, different domains of empowerment that might be similar or different in different settings.
Would any other panelists like to talk about these kinds of measurement issues and how well the right kind of measures for women's empowerment compare across different settings that you've studied?
I'll just say it's
if not, we have others
for us. Yeah, we spend a lot of time debating it, but it's a tough one for the same questions to mean the same thing in these very different contexts. So.
Yeah, if I may, it's a bit of a trick question. It requires a lot of background research before you can figure out what are the exact indicators for a particular, for example, empowerment. I'm currently doing a qualitative study on women's economic empowerment in Nepal on livelihoods issues. And for empowerment, the proxy variable that I used for the quantitative data was, do you travel to the bank on your own? Do you manage your business finances on your own? But that was a very specific case in the context of Nepal. So I'm saying that even within South Asia, these things vary significantly. I mean, if I was trying to do the same study with the same questionnaire in India, I would have to choose a different set of indicators for the same question, for the same topic of empowerment. So it's very context specific. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So we have a question asking about social protection, and I actually would like to connect this question. So Foluke has asked, there's a proposal by the Special Rapporteur on Poverty calling for a global fund on social protection. Would you all say that that will be a global gain? And I would like to connect that also to Jan, you've worked a lot on different aspects of cash transfers. I think the study you presented today wasn't focusing that much on the COVID specific situation, but it would be great to hear from both you and Jakob and anybody else on the panel who wants to talk about how the social safety net policies might be particularly relevant in the post-COVID era. Do we know enough yet about what kind of how they might be mitigating some of the negative impacts of the pandemic on women that you highlighted, Jakob, and what do we still have to learn in order to design those policies well and target them well? So Jan, do you want to go first, and then we can turn over to Jakob or anyone else who'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, of course, a big question, and hopefully Jakob has some more specific, some more nuance. I think, I think that social protection can work better for some subgroups rather than others. And I think that it's important to be mindful about who has access, who's best targeted, how to best structure these programs in different contexts and for different target populations. I think it's important to be mindful of the heterogeneous impacts of these programs for different subgroups, especially those who are worst off or most affected in the population. So, yeah, that's a answer. I'll turn it over to Jakob.
Thank you. I understand that the question is about a global fund on social protection, and to be honest, I'm not familiar with the initiative. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. So I cannot really say anything directly on this initiative of a global fund itself. Maybe a few quick thoughts. I think when we're talking about social protection in this session, we're primarily actually talking about social assistance, right? So cash transfers, for instance, would be a part of that, direct support to those who are either vulnerable, at risk, or in poverty, to support them. The way in which this has to be designed to have optimal effects for women, I would expect and think is quite context dependent, right? So in some settings, for instance, women may be restricted in terms of accessing finance. They could be potentially at risk if they go to an ATM, for instance. So that is an opportunity to use a social protection system, provide payments, for instance, through digital means, and resolve some of the challenges that women are facing to benefit from these kinds of programs, and at the same time achieve an increase in their financial inclusion. And so there are other examples for other contexts. So I'm not familiar with the Global Fund, but I do think the solutions are context specific and not global.
Thanks a lot. I have a question that I want to direct to Susan, because we haven't talked as much about the political dimensions of this. We've got a mix of different disciplines here, but you mentioned, of course, in your presentation that the rollout of the Medicare itself, the interventions and the studies have been delayed by COVID. But and so, of course, there are immediate short-term impacts of that in terms of how long it takes us to learn what we want to learn from the Medicare. But do you think we can see from that the pandemic is also leading to longer-term disruption in how women are forming social and political capital in these contexts, and how these kinds of interventions might operate? And if so, what should policymakers or implementers be doing to adjust?
I want to be a little careful. I think that's a really interesting question. What I have is essentially anecdote. I don't have a systematic answer to the question, but most of the teams have reported to us that their implementing partners have suggested that women have become more isolated and less likely to have been able to voice concerns to local officials and whatnot during the pandemic. Again, totally anecdotal. But I think it rings true in a way. Many of us experienced increased isolation ourselves as a result of the pandemic. But another thing that's clear is just how differently the pandemic was felt across different countries, but then also in urban and rural areas. And I think the teams are still sort of getting their heads around exactly what that means for their studies. But we have thought about just we thought about trying to be more specific in the types of local services that the project was focused on that might be particularly beneficial to women who are coming back from some potential enhanced isolation from their communities during COVID. But again, it's a little bit of a silly point, but we have to get it right such that it's true for all of our studies. And it's just very hard to do that because the differences were so varied across even just the 5 studied sites and how communities experienced the pandemic and when they've experienced it and whether they've been receiving the opportunity to have vaccines. And some places just seem to have not had it very bad too in a really and I'm not, we continue to be a little bit unsure if that's about reporting or if it's really true that they just haven't had as much of a problem with the pandemic that many communities have. So.
Great. Well, I have more questions for all of you. The attendees have more questions for all of you, but we are over time. So we will bring the event to a close. I want to thank DCID for organizing the event and all of our fantastic panelists for sharing their exciting and cutting edge research on these important issues. A couple people asked in the Q&A about the availability of information from the session today. So both the recording and at least some, if not all of the slides will be posted on the event page soon. So keep a lookout for that. Thanks so much to everyone and have a wonderful Women's Day.